when Manisha and I first started talking about the scope and purpose of this conference, we did not anticipate what was to unfold in the overlapping worlds of philanthropy and social justice movements. The uproar and outrage over Darren Walker's endorsement of more humane forms of incarceration and his cynical dismissal of abolitionist critique and practice as extremism makes this conference ever more needed, ever more urgent. You all know that the vote is going down as we stand here. So I was very tempted to urge you to join me in a march to the vote, but we'll be here. So I'm very grateful to have this time with you this morning. My talk today poses the question of what it might mean to imagine and practice decolonizing philanthropy. I pose this question from a very specific vantage point, which is the public university, which, like philanthropy, is an institution of racial capitalism. I'm especially interested in powerful institutions, foundations, museums, universities, whose power lies not only in material resources, but also in epistemic and symbolic resources, in the power to produce and control knowledge. I use the term decolonizing with great caution, because like so many other terms of critical thought, the term has come to be appropriated and depoliticized. So I want to remind us all of this incredibly important article that came out a few years ago, that decolonization is not a metaphor. Tak and Yang in this piece remind us that decolonization requires action, radical action, and the decolonial desires can enact resettlement and reoccupation. I use the term decolonizing from amidst ongoing struggle, grappling with the structures of knowledge and power that define the elite university, and what it means to embed such struggle in anti-colonial, abolitionist, and feminist legacies of rebellion and resistance. So I hope that thinking from the vantage point of the elite public university will provide some insights this morning into the relationship between philanthropy and racial capitalism, and at what it might take to undo or at least trouble that relationship. 2 days after Trump's election in November 2016, I walked into my histories and theories of urban planning class that I teach every fall at UCLA, that is the core course for all of our graduate students. I'd stayed up all night rereading a book that in that moment was one of the few texts that allowed me to make sense of the world. This book, W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction in America, published in 1935, with a subtitle worth paying attention to where the history of the part which Black folk played in the attempt to reconstruct democracy in America, 1860 to 1880. An extraordinary history and an extraordinary political economy, Black Reconstruction is also a vision of abolition democracy. After all, the 90 students gathered in my classroom that morning wanted to talk not only about the renewal of white supremacy in the United States, but also about the possibilities of democracy. Out of that moment and out of our collective rereading of Du Bois came a student-organized course at UCLA and the broader endeavor that we have been calling abolitionist planning. And I urge you at a later time to go to our website and take a look at this wonderful resource guide that our students produced, mainly as a way of transforming urban planning curricula around the country. But in response to this effort to recast urban planning in relation to abolitionism came a powerful critique penned by Deshaunet Dozier, then a graduate student at CUNY Graduate Center. She wrote a piece titled, "There is no room for planners in the movement for abolition." Dozier argued that, I quote, "The fight for abolition is aside from and not something that can be fully incorporated into professional planning." She went on to say the planning has become a central conduit of the very forms of violence that abolition seeks to end: colonial and capitalist violence against Black, brown, and indigenous communities and bodies. She also drew a distinction between insurgent planners, whom she described as those who continuously put freedom into motion and do so often without a paycheck or job title, and planners who get degrees and or compensation from institutions of colonial harm. Abolition, Dozier concluded, is not nor ever will be about planners. It's about practitioners of freedom dreams. Dozier's critique has been vitally important for us at UCLA as we think about the possibility of abolitionist planning. But I share it today because I'm sure it's apparent to you that we can easily substitute the term philanthropy for the term urban planning. Is there room for funders? I'm like, I know. Someone's clapping back. I know. I'm happy to do this without a mic, but I think we need the mic for the Zoom thing. Yeah? All right. So the question I wanted to pose is this: is there room for funders in the movement for abolition? Can philanthropy participate in unmaking colonial logics of violence and oppression? What does insurgency look like for philanthropy? I'm a scholar who has spent much of her academic life and career at the extraordinary public university system that is the University of California, first at Berkeley and now at LA. I've fought for the future of public education on the barricades and strike lines at Berkeley, at protest marches in Sacramento. I've held and resigned leadership positions. I've held power and I've fought power. I have mobilized to preserve public universities while being acutely aware that our public universities sit on stolen land. Their edifices built on the grounds of indigenous dispossession and death. In the case of UCLA, on lands stripped from the Tongva caretakers of land. I'm acutely aware that universities have taken to land acknowledgements, but as this recent snarky tweet by the Decolonial Atlas Collective indicates, such acknowledgements require of us not just declarations, but actions. Okay. I'm acutely aware then that the disciplines of the modern university are fully implicated in colonial harm, as Dozier pointed out. In fact, urban planning, my discipline, what I've chosen to inhabit all my life, has systematically produced the landscapes of segregation and elimination that my enthusiastic students now want to undo through abolitionist planning. How then do we decolonize the university? At UCLA, I have the great privilege of serving as the founding director of the Institute on Inequality and Democracy. Established in 2016, we are what I call a small but mighty center that supports research and scholarship concerned with dispossession and displacement in the United States, as well as at keynote of global connection, specifically India, Brazil, South Africa, and Spain. Organizing knowledge to challenge urban color lines, we work in alliance with social movements, community organizations, tenant unions, and debtor unions. We call our key methodology, as you will see in this fourth column, decolonizing the university. And as I've noted before, I think our struggle to enact this methodology bears insights for the scope and purpose of this conference. So key to the decolonial method is that we have to know our history. I was delighted to see listed as best practice number 1 in FJ's important vision document, Journey Towards Intersectional Grant Making, this argument about a historical frame. We need such a historical frame, I would argue, not only in relation to the economic structures and relations that we wish to transform, but also in relation to the very institutions, be it universities or foundations, in which we are situated. And that is much more difficult to do. So I told you earlier about teaching in the wake of Trump's election. Well, just about a week before Trump's election, the Institute, then just a few months old, convened a closed-door workshop called Wealth, Inequality and Philanthropy, which brought together powerful foundations, powerful movement leaders, and prominent academic scholars of philanthropy. We did not continue that line of work after Trump's election, partly because our front lines of struggle shifted, and partly because we came to focus on decolonizing the university rather than decolonizing philanthropy. We figured fixing philanthropy was philanthropy's problem. But the starting point of our conceptualization of wealth, inequality, and philanthropy came from the work of abolitionist scholar Ruth Wilson Gilmore. And I cannot resist but share with you this recent photo of Professor Gilmore casting a withering glare at a portrait of you-know-who in the context of the No New Jails NYC struggle. Gilmore has argued that foundations are repositories of twice stolen wealth. The profits reaped by the extractive processes of racial capitalism and the sheltering of such profit from taxes. Any orientation towards justice requires a scrutiny of and historical accounting for such wealth. But such historical accounting is quite sparse, partly because the most powerful foundations are able to protect themselves from the scrutiny of research and public debate. Now, so my own work as a scholar has been about very powerful institutions. So in this book, Poverty Capital, I share a 5-year-long ethnography that I conducted of the apparatus of international development and global finance, and much of it was an ethnographic engagement with the World Bank, USAID, and powerful Wall Street banks like Deutsche Bank, right? I studied entangled circuits of capital and truth. And as an ethnographer, I had to puncture those worlds of truth-making. In the case of truth-making foundations, when we step behind the stage of current social justice talk, we find a complicated history that situates current controversies in a long trajectory of accommodation with racial capitalism. So my own research on community action and community development in the 1960s has been about the Ford Foundation. And we look at the ways in which the Ford Foundation played a crucial role in conceptualizing and promoting programs of pacification in US cities. A precursor of the war on poverty, these pioneering programs, on the one hand, promoted community organizations that became the template for community action and community development, but on the other hand, deepened the policing of perceived social problems such as juvenile delinquency. Above all, these Ford Foundation programs were shaped by white liberal anxiety about the changing racial composition of urban neighborhoods, a transformation that Paul Ilvaskar, then at the Ford Foundation, dubbed gray areas. So here again, I can substitute the term Ford Foundation with my discipline, urban planning, and arrive at much of the same conclusion about pacification. What this means then is that we who inhabit the institutions of colonial harm, who hold jobs within them, or benefit from them in one way or the other, must be brutally honest about their histories. In a response to Walker's In Defense of Nuance blog post, Dylan Rodriguez, professor of UC at Riverside and president-elect of the American Studies Association, wrote an important critical response, you'll find it online, where he, quote, illuminates the Ford Foundation's historical position as a philanthropic extension of hegemonic racial, corporate, and military relations of power, while compelling a vital reconsideration of what such philanthropic institutions actually mean when they institutionalize the terms of racial equity, social justice, and hope. We must do this repeatedly for foundations, for universities, and much more. So it is from this place of historical analysis that at the Institute on Inequality and Democracy, we have been grappling with the effort to decolonize the university. And let me share with you a few of the principles we are trying to forge in the hope that this will resonate with your own concerns and struggles in intersectional grant making and radical philanthropy. The first is what in the last year or so I have been calling research justice. Across its priority themes, from housing justice to mass incarceration, the Institute pursues research and scholarship, as I noted earlier, in alliance with social movements and community organizations. Now, note that I'm not using the word solidarity. I'm saying in alliance or in accompaniment. I find the term solidarity to be one that is quite challenging. There's a wonderful interview that Amy Goodman conducted a few years ago with Augusto Boal, founder of the Theater of the Oppressed, before he passed away. In it, Boal talks about traveling to the rural interior of Brazil to stage a play. Actors and peasants participated in the theater, and the story of that play was about a rebellion by landless peasants against landlords. Right? So they had their fake rifles on the stage, and they were staging this rebellion. After the play was over, peasants came up to the actors and to Boal and said, "This is wonderful, the play is now over. Now take up the real rifles and join us as we stage an insurrection against the landlords who have been exploiting us." And Boal realized at that moment that he was not in solidarity with peasants. He has this line that has always stayed with me. He said, "Solidarity means taking the same risks as those that you're in solidarity with. I do not take the same risks as the movements with which we are allied. I do not take the same risks as the unhoused living on the streets of Los Angeles. I do not, right? I'm in alliance with them. I cannot claim to be in solidarity with them." One of the movements we are proud to ally with is the Debt Collective, which comes out of Occupy Wall Street. One of the co-founders of the Debt Collective just became Associate Faculty Director of the Institute. So the Debt Collective, as many of you possibly know, has played a major role in the grassroots organizing that has now made the cancellation of student debt and College for All a national common sense. But in a series of deeply critical articles, the founders of the Debt Collective have noted that such a sea change in public and political opinion requires collaboration between many institutions, including academia and grassroots organizations. Yet they note, as does Anne Larson in this piece, that academia too often treats activist-led organizations as objects of study rather than as potential partners. In her call for reciprocal relationships, Anne Larson noted that funding from our very tiny institute was useful because we did two things. We provided unrestricted funds, and we did not ask for academically legible outcomes. But let's push the question of research justice a bit further by returning to Dozier's provocation around colonial harm. Academia has excelled at extractive and exploitative research. And community organizations and movements are no longer keeping silent about these relationships of harm. So here are two brief glimpses. As I'm sure you all know, one of the most influential interlocutors in the field of housing research and advocacy is Matthew Desmond, whose book Evicted made evictions a national headline. He went on then to found various research organizations focused on evictions. But housing activists, including at some of the organizations we proudly ally with at the Institute, including organizations such as the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, have called out Desmond in this piece, for example, for practices of big data production that rely on the extraction of eviction data from grassroots movements and the purchase of data from tenant screening companies. The authors conclude in this piece, Desmond often criticizes scholars of poverty for ignoring the myriad ways that poverty is profitable. However, Desmond seems to have no concern about paying corporations that profit from, exploit, and aid in evictions. What then is research justice? My other example is from Los Angeles. In our work against the criminalization of poverty, we ally with and learn from an amazing grassroots movement called Stop LAPD Spying. And you'll see that little logo at the bottom of this. This is one of their recent reports on predictive policing in LA. So Stop LAPD Spying has drawn attention to the algorithms of predictive policing used by the LA Police Department, algorithms that are saturated with the logic of white supremacy. But as Stop LAPD Spying has also shown, these algorithms have been produced by a distinguished professor of anthropology at UCLA, Jeffrey Brantingham, who has used his academic legitimacy to launch a massive consulting firm called Predpol. Okay? Put bluntly, what we had thought was a fight with the LA Police Department and the colonial institution of racialized policing had to be brought home to our own labs and classrooms, to our own disciplines of academic knowledge. So key for us at the Institute on Inequality and Democracy, a central piece of research justice for us is relationships of accountability. Post-colonial feminist Gayatri Spivak, whose work for me is foundational, reminds us that so much of the hegemony of development, of social justice interventions is undertaken in the name of responsibility. We feel responsible for saving someone. We feel responsible for fixing someone. Dylan Rodriguez, in his recent critique of Darren Walker, calls this white humanitarianism. Spivak insists that we must shift from responsibility to accountability. I'm very clear then at the Institute on Inequality and Democracy that our research and scholarship is not accountable to powerful decision makers. We are not accountable to the mayor of LA. We're not accountable to city council. We're not accountable to the board of supervisors or the donors whose endowment made the Institute possible. We are accountable to communities on the front lines of dispossession and displacement. So let me just say that our institutions have become very adept at a lot of rhetoric and bureaucracy about what at the universities is called diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, right? We're all now social justice warriors. But in most of our institutions, there are very few material practices of accountability to the communities most in crisis, most under duress. Now, it's important to emphasize that these material practices of accountability are not easily reconciled with the knowledge power structures of our institutions, be it universities or foundations, or even social movements. For us, they require creating what Hani and Merton in this incredible manifesto call the undercommons. For them, the undercommons is a transformational infrastructure. It's a transformational infrastructure that in fact bears resemblance to the many forms of transformational infrastructure that make up the long history of abolitionist struggle in the United States. Hani and Merton's vision of undercommons is as a space of subversion. It's similar to how Robin D.G. Kelley, my comrade at UCLA, has conceptualized Black study. Kelley talks about Black study as a form of learning that exists within, but is in explicit opposition to a Eurocentric university culture with ties to corporate and military power. Hani and Merton write, the undercommons is a fugitive network where a commitment to abolition and collectivity prevails over a university culture bent on creating socially isolated individuals whose academic skepticism and claims of objectivity leave the world as it is intact. They note to build this kind of collectivity, to turn the university into an undercommons, we, those at the university, have to articulate a criminal relationship to the institutions within which we are situated. A key part of that criminality is the redistribution of resources, but it is also a resolute politics of rebellion and refusal. So yes, I'm director of a research institute at UCLA, and we have a criminal relationship to the University of California. I say this publicly, I say it all the time, I say it to my dean, I say it to my chancellor. My final point in relation to the provocation of philanthropy and racial capitalism has to do with how we as individuals forge a politics of rebellion and refusal within powerful institutions. So a couple of years ago, in reference to Colin Kaepernick, I asked my urban planning students what it would mean for us to take a knee in urban planning. Right? And taking a knee, as you know, comes with sacrifice. It's clear that Kaepernick will not play again in the NFL. So he was able to call out that particular structure of what I call plantation capitalism, because that's what the NFL is today. But it also set into motion a whole series of other complicities and betrayals. Let me not go into the whole Jay-Z story here, okay? So there are complex storylines of co-optation, but what does it mean for us to take a knee within the structures of racial capitalism within which we work and within which many of us hold pretty powerful positions? So it can be argued that none of us have the agency to shift institutions of colonial harm, be it foundations or universities. But I would argue that's not necessarily the case. For me, one of the most important scholars of philanthropy and social change is Erica Cole-Aranis, whose book, The Self-Help Myth, provides a careful analysis of the entanglements between foundations and the farm worker movement in the Central Valley of California. Erica Cole-Aranis is also now faculty director of a nationwide organization called Imagining America that some of you might be familiar with. She's also professor of American Studies at the University of California, Davis. But the piece of Erica's work that I wanted to share with you today is actually not from this book. It's from a recently published article in a journal called Antipode, which is a journal of radical geography. And in it, Erica focuses on program officers working in powerful foundations. That got your attention, huh? Showing how they perform what she calls the moral life of philanthropy, and thus negotiate hierarchies of race, class, and gender while trying to challenge structural inequalities. A couple of statements by her interviewees might sound painfully familiar to some of you. We've already heard a bit of it this morning. So 2 quotes only. I could have spent all morning reading from that article. The first quote from one of Erica's interviewees. All of a sudden, I had a job in a New York City skyscraper. I knew who I was on the inside, but I knew I had to play a certain role. I had to look and act confident, but not threatening. There was no room at all for my ethnicity. Here I was, a feminist Latina, trapped in this white, moneyed environment that required that I hide who I am. I was often silently angry at hiding, but at the same time, proud of getting money out the door to communities I cared about. I know. Talking about full selves, right? All of a sudden, I had a job in a New York City skyscraper. I knew who I was on the inside, but I knew I had to play a certain role. This is the line that kills me, because trust me, women of color in academia feel this way too. I had to look and act confident, but not threatening. There was no room at all for my ethnicity. Here I was, a feminist Latina trapped in this white moneyed environment that required that I hide who I am. I was often silently angry at hiding, but at the same time proud of getting money out the door to communities I cared about. A second quote, a shorter one. You have to work hard at not coming off as a political person of color with an agenda. I was successful because they liked that I knew all the rules. So I was reminded of Erica's essay, which is one of the rare ethnographic engagements I've seen with program officers and foundations. And we need much more of that kind of research and truth-telling. I was reminded of this as the No New Jails NYC movement issued a call to workers at the Ford Foundation and other philanthropic structures to join them in abolitionist struggle. Such politics of rebellion and refusal against and within our institutions is necessarily uneven. Some are visible, many are not. So in a post-racial world, universities and foundations have both been structured and restructured through new forms of whiteness, particularly those that uphold white liberalism through bureaucracies of diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? So we are all now trained to identify our implicit bias, right? But civility, I would argue, has taken the place of civil disobedience. Academic freedom has made peace with hate speech. All is well. So years ago, for my Poverty Capital book, as I studied that apparatus of international development, and I developed a concept that might be still relevant today. I developed the concept of what I call the double agent. The double agent works within institutions of colonial harm. She is fully implicated in these institutions, but she also seizes on and creates political openings to stage subversion, to be insurgent. The idea of doubleness, specifically of a double consciousness, is repeatedly stated in Black cultural studies, for example, in the writings of W.E.B. Du Bois. It connotes belonging as well as outsideness, right? It's what feminists have called an insider-outsider positionality. So I often rely on the words of postcolonial feminist Gayatri Spivak to indicate what this ontology is. She has a line, a little complicated, but worth thinking through. The impossible no to a structure which one critiques, yet inhabits intimately. The impossible no to a structure which one critiques, yet inhabits intimately. So there are many forms that our no can take. And there are many sanctions for such a no. Many. In academia, certain forms of critique and refusal, notably of Israeli occupation or American imperialism, have brought harsh sanctions even against tenured faculty who have been fired from their positions, especially faculty of color. But there are forms of no. In architecture, some of you might remember that days after Trump's election, the American Institute of Architects pledged support for the new president and asked to join the president in the building of infrastructure. And there was a huge backlash amongst the 89,000 members of the AIA. And then the AIA issued a wishy-washy statement saying, we believe in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And powerful architecture deans were asked to comment on this, and for the most part, they gave wishy-washy statements, except one, Jonathan Massey, who's now dean at Michigan, where he said, we've got to say no. Withholding our labor as architects is some of the most important forms of agency we can exercise at the moment. He said, no, we're not going to build that border wall. We're not going to build the cages and prisons, right? That withholding of labor, that no is crucial. But such no saying often remains isolated incidents of individual courage. Decolonial methodologies, crafted in the long history of anti-colonial and abolitionist struggle, remind us that we must build collectivities. And for me, this is important in the work that all of you are doing together. that we must build what Harney and Moten call fugitive networks. And I see this as a fugitive network, right? We have to reconstruct our institutions, not in the mold of white humanitarianism and white liberalism, but rather with a commitment to abolition democracy. And we have to consider our relations of accountability. We have to do so collectively. So let me leave you then with a question posed by one of the most important interlocutors of decolonial knowledge, Walter Mignolo, who writes a lot about disobedience. And Mignolo, as I've been rereading his work, has this wonderful question that I think is worth sitting with. A decolonial question posed to our institutions, he notes, would be this: why would you want to save capitalism and not save human beings? Thank you, everyone.